What are you looking for? What am I looking for? What are we looking for in terms of criteria, making that decision to purchase a new board game, to jump in with a new title? That's what I wanted to share in this board game vlog. And then, of course, in the comments, get your approach, get your take, get your filter on it. Now, with my board gaming collection, I have three groups of games. The first group are games that they're on my gaming table. They're there in a portable box that I regularly bring to the gaming club. These are titles that, for the most part, I play anywhere from weekly to monthly. I've got a great looking shelf and setup in the Fritz cave. They never even make it to the shelf because I'm always playing them. The second group are games that I really, really love, some amazing titles, but the stars, they need to align. They're not a casual type game. Examples would be TI, Twilight Imperium, Kingdom Death Monster, Descent First Edition. These are games that either you plan for a long play session or you do your best to go in with a campaign. And then the third group of games are games that I enjoy for the narrative. They don't get played as much because I'm immersed in that narrative elsewhere, but sometimes I feel like experiencing that narrative from a different perspective. Fritz, what do you mean? Warhammer 40,000. It's a sci-fi miniature-based game. I love it. I play a lot of it. Space Hulk is a board game set in that narrative. Blackstone Fortress is a board game set in that narrative. I play a lot of 40K. Occasionally I dip into the board games. So narrative that's found elsewhere, some of the D&D adventure games, titles like that. This third group, which get played time to time depending on how I'm feeling. So within that framework of exploring it, the question, of course, is when you're going to invest in a new board game, it's not only physical resources, but it's time. Time is in you're going to be playing this title, or time not used not playing the title. I mean, we've been there where you've acquired a title and you played a couple of games, you're open to it, but for whatever reason, it's just not working. That's, of course, different than maybe you acquire a title, you play it a lot, you really enjoy it, but for whatever reason, things change or your perspective changes and you're ready to kind of move on to it. That's time well invested. So yes, absolutely the resources, but looking at the time. So the first question I ask, I do my best to exercise some impulse control and not be persuaded, influenced by the miniatures and all the expansions, because I am a completionist. This is a dual bad place to be as a board game enthusiast, someone that's a completionist with poor impulse control. But the first thing I ask is this a title based on the narrative that I like? Meaning, I like RPG type games. I like fantasy setting type games. I like dungeon crawlers. I like games that involve heroes fighting bosses, especially bonus points if it's a dragon. So from that perspective, those are the titles that I kind of gravitate towards. Now, that's not to say I'm not open to something outside of that, but if it's outside of that, then my criteria changes to, is this something I can have fun with my friends? Now, that's also a primary criteria of the other games, but it really has to be something unique. Surprisingly, now I track, I'm pretty solid about it. Being a completionist, I track the plays of all my titles in my collection on an Excel sheet. And for the most part, it's up to date. Sometimes I write things down on just a piece of scrap paper and I'm like, I'll update later. I also keep track of plays of board games of other titles that my friends might have, or if I go to the gaming club and play those. A surprising game, an example of a game that I normally would never have picked to play, and it was pure impulse, but it turned out to be gold. Does it qualify as a game? Fireball Island. I jumped in on that Kickstarter because that's one of those games like Dark Tower where it's been out of print forever. It's like rare. It's this, it's that. And they reprinted it. And I have to say, it wasn't a money grab. It was really love of the game. Very affordable. I'm like, okay, I'll jump in. Why not, right? And picked up the game, played it a few times, played it with some friends. It's just a lot of fun to play. Yes, it's silly with marbles rolling around and stuff like that happening, but it's a lot of fun to play. The game works. It's like an ultimate beer and pretzels game. Is it a board game? Is it an action game? Is it an underpriced toy? I don't know, but it's not a title that I would normally buy. But we have had so much fun playing this game that it's kind of risen to the top of the criteria of games that I play. Surprisingly, I crunched the numbers, hit the macro, and it's interesting the titles that gravitate towards the top and the perception of titles that gravitate towards the bottom. So if it's outside of my regular criteria, I want it to be a game that we're going to have a lot of fun with. Another game on that level, I'm spacing on the name a little bit. I think it's Push Car. It's these little wooden tokens with cars and a wooden track, and you flick your car around the track. It's crazy. We have a lot of fun playing that. Then, of course, there's more serious board games like War of the Ring and things like that. But jumping back on. So the first thing is the criteria. Being honest with myself, is this a title that I enjoy, or is this a title that I know other people could enjoy and it would be worth having it in my collection for that? The next piece I look at is the narrative, right? This idea of, now I know we're getting into hybrid more and more. You've got physical components and then you've got digital. I'm going to put that aside for a moment, app-based games, and just focus on pure analog. What we're doing is we're setting something up to sit down solo, to sit down with friends, to sit down with new friends that we're going to make. And for 2 or 3 hours or however long the game plays, we're immersing ourselves in that world. So I want, this is hard. I can't say exactly, but I want the miniatures. I want the tokens. I want the artwork. I want the layout of the board to facilitate a feeling that when the game is set up and I get into it, I'm not really aware of the rules. I mean, yes, I'm following the rule mechanics, but I'm not really aware of the rules. I'm in that moment. I'm in that dungeon. I'm in that place. I'm in that Space Hulk, whatever it's going to be. And almost like if you step back for a moment and look at the game, you're like, wow, this is really, really amazing. This is really, really interesting. So from that perspective, pulling that together. Now, are you surprised that rules are not like at the height of my list? Rules as in, am I playing a board game or a war game or a competitive type game? For the most part, if the rules are functional and they kind of do something different, they kind of do something fun, they kind of do something unique, that's what I'm interested in, even if they're a little bit clunky. What do I mean by that? Well, I'm a big Runebound enthusiast. 2nd edition, 3rd edition. Played a ton of 2nd edition, dice-based mechanics. 3rd edition releases. Maybe we'll get a 4th edition. That would be really cool. 3rd edition kept a lot of the core rules, but what they did with the attacks and bonuses and things like that, they replaced dice with dice modifiers. So your Runebound character is a fantasy type game. You've got your base stats and you roll a d10 and you've got to get certain numbers. You add to that bonuses in terms of abilities or magic objects, magic items or followers, and you got to beat scores. I mean, pretty straightforward. Runebound 3rd edition created, runes are a big part of the game, the narrative. They created these cardboard tokens, these cardboard pogs. I guess they're about the size of a 50-cent piece. And there's Fantasy Flight stats on them, little lightning bolts and little symbols and like +1 damage and skulls and shields. And your character starts the game with these tokens. As you acquire magic items, there's pictures of the magic item on the token pog, and you get that pog and it has more symbols and bonuses. So the idea is in combat or tests, you take all of your tokens, pogs, runes, cast them on the table and interpret the results and check them against your character card and activate. Think about a Fantasy Flight dice-based mechanic to that. It's kind of neat. You got to think about some things. Sometimes a pog falls on the table. It's not as elegant as dice, but it's kind of cool. It's kind of neat. So I'm looking for things like that. Where, what is the narrative like? What are the rules like? Does it try to do something kind of unique? And does it capture based on the presentation of the game? Now, the holy grail of board gaming, replayability, right? Replayability. If it's not a competitive head-to-head game, like Game of Thrones, I don't really need replayability in that. It's the same thing every time, but it's the players and the alliances that you form. Jumping back in, it's pretty interesting for the new year. We've started to get the old Axis and Allies crew together, and I haven't played in 10 years. You know, I'm a legend in my own mind, but my skills have deteriorated on the Axis side. So it's interesting from that. I framework that, so we're jumping into that, and we're probably going to get into some more Axis and Allies on the channel here. But from playing that, what's interesting is it's the same thing every time. And there's opening moves that are pretty much opening moves that you want to make if you're playing competitively based on the setup, because the setup is more or less fixed. But replayability is massive. Massive. It's like War of the Ring. Replayability is massive because it depends on the players of it. Now, if it's not a competitive game or more of a fantasy-based game, the replayability comes in the missions and random elements and how those things play out. So I am looking towards replayability. A great example of replayability is the Zombicide type games, whether it's modern, fantasy, or Black Plague, or Invader. The missions are the same, right? Start on this side of the table, navigate these 3 objectives, and get to the exit point on the other side of the table. You're like, Fritz, that's the same thing every time, right? But the zombies spawn randomly. You flip over cards, they spawn randomly in different levels. So you could have some zombies that spawn deep on your side of the board and hold you up. You could have ones that spawn deep on the other side of the board. All sorts of randomness in there. Now, I'm not saying random makes for replayability, but it does kind of. So I'm looking in terms of replayability. Another example, Gloomhaven replayability. First, you got to get through the game. You got to make your way through the game before you even think about replayability. But then going back and exploring favorite missions, exploring different missions, replayability, that's like a game like if I'm on an island, I'm going to bring Gloomhaven. Or if I'm going to be like, this is a game you can only play for the next year, I'll play Gloomhaven. And we'll just live gloomy. I mean, it's fantastic. So I am looking for replayability. That criteria is what I do my best. And I say do my best to judge, am I going to acquire this title? Because, of course, I've seen games where absolute fantastic miniatures, and I'm like, I'm in. Fritz, you don't even know the game. These miniatures are great. Being a wargamer, I'm in, right? It's hard sometimes. But looking at it from the perspective, what is that checklist? This, and that's going to help acquire that title. Because again, it goes back to whatever your criteria is. Board gaming, we want to have fun. The time invested in it, I want to play it. There's nothing worse than having a board game on your shelf, looking at it. It's taunting you. And it's not for lack of players or time, but you're like, I tried. It just doesn't work. We want to make sure that title works.